Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Yud Tet. Today's daf is dedicated by Deborah Ashem Weiss from New York City in loving memory of her father, David Asheim, David Moshe ben Meir, whose 41st yahrzeit is today. Daddy, you were taken from us too early in life. I miss you. You laid the foundations for who I am today. You'd be so proud of me and Robert and our children and grandchildren. And also by Cliff Felig in honor of Miriam Ferziger Felig on her birthday. Mazal Tov. We're going to start our daf at the bottom of Yud Tet a bit. What we learned yesterday was this issue of pi tikra yoreh v'sotem. Do we say in a sukkah that we can view the walls in specifically this case of an achsadra, where we had a portico, and then, right, there was house, portico, and then schach. Can we view the walls of the portico as if they come down and create a sukkah? Abaye said yes, Rava said no. Then we tried to say maybe it's the same debate as between Rav and Shmuel about the achsadra and a bik'ah. If I put up 4 poles in the middle of a valley and I put a roof on top, can we view those walls as if there's imaginary walls here, they go down, and is it the same machloket? By Eruvin, right there, really, it's the Reshut of Shabbat. Are you allowed to carry within that space? Is it a private domain or not? So there, Rav had said you can carry in it. It's considered a private domain. So we view the walls as going down, which would sound like Abaye. And Shmuel says, no, we do not say that. So now the Gemara says, so they suggested maybe that's the same machloket. Rava holds like Shmuel, and Abaye holds like Rav. But the Gemara says, no. Shmuel says it doesn't work. There's no way that you could read Abaye into that. In other words, according to Shmuel, clearly Abaye would have to disagree with Shmuel, and Rav would agree with Abaye would disagree, right? And Rava would agree with Shmuel that we don't say pi tikra yoreh v'sotem. However, so that's cool, right? Aliba de Shmuel kol alma lepliga. There's no way to understand it otherwise, but one agrees with him, one doesn't. However, ki pligi aliba de Rav. But you could say that within Rav, who said that in a achsadra bebika, these 4 poles, we view the walls as if they go down. Well, you could say that still, even though Rav says this works here, we could still have a debate by Sukkah. We could say Abaye kirav. So Abaye, who simply says, yes, we say pi tikra yoreh v'sotem in the Sukkah, will say the exact same thing here. But Rava Amar Lecha, Rava could say, Ad kan lo amar Rav hatam, ela de mechitza l'achsadra Davide. There's a big difference between those 4 poles that I put up with and then roofed it. What was the point of putting them up if not to create a roof and create these imaginary walls? I basically wanted to designate this as a space for the inside space under the achsadra. Aval hacha, we saw this issue before. There, what walls are we using for the portico? The walls of the house. And when we created the portico, the walls of the house and the beams on the portico were meant really, hacha de lav lahachi avide lo. Here they weren't built for that inside space. They were really built, right? You could say really the beams of the achsadra were meant for the portico. They weren't meant for the sukkah, right? This is like we saw before, the walls of the house were created for the inside and not for the outside space. That's what we talked about, the same case, but we were using the walls of the house. Here we're talking about the beams of the portico that are holding the portico up. Those were created for the portico, which is outside the sukkah. They weren't created for the sukkah itself. So when we have the achsadra in the valley, or we have this portico and we put up beams, it was for the portico itself, which is what the space we're talking about, that we want to create these imaginary mechitzot. Here we want the mechitzot to be between the portico and the sukkah, really for the purposes of the sukkah. That's not what the portico beams were created for. They were created for the portico itself. So therefore, you might distinguish here. Okay, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily say the same thing. Tanan. Now we're going to bring a question on Abaye from our Mishnah. Because Abaye said you could use pi tikra yoreh v'sotem in achsadra. If that's the case, then our Mishnah doesn't make any sense. It said in our Mishnah, "B'chein chatzera mukefet achsadra." Right, you have a courtyard with an achsadra around it, and we said only if it's within 4 amot of the wall would it work. But if it's farther than 4 amot from the house, it won't work. But why wouldn't it work? We could view these imaginary walls of the achsadra. It should totally work. So Tirgam Rava, Liba d'Abaye, Rava explains the case the way Abaye would, tries to prove Abaye, and let's pull up the pictures here. He says, it's when Kishehishva et kiruyo. Pi tikra yoreh v'sotem works because we have a clear barrier where the portico ends and the schach starts. But Abaye will say, this is Rava's explanation for Abaye for the Mishnah, that this only works in what case? If the schach is exactly flush up against the end of the portico, before, if you remember, this picture had the schach overlapping the portico, in which case it was still very clear when you're in the sukkah where the portico ends. If you have it exactly at the same level, then it's not really noticeable. Even if it's different material, it's still not noticeable enough to have pitika yoreh v'soteim work. And that's how Abai would have to understand the mission. So Surah had this version of that we saw. There's exactly the same type of sugya we saw the other day, that there was one version of it of who said what and what the debate was. That it was based on, according to, right, this past version of Surah was pitik yoreh v'soteim machloket Abai v'Rava. But Pumbedita Matne, they had a different version in Pumbedita. Sikech al gabei achsadra she'ein la ptzimim. If you have, let's stop the pictures right now. We'll get back to the pictures in a minute. If you have an achsad and you put schach and it doesn't have any ptzimin, it doesn't have any of these poles coming down. Those were the pictures from yesterday where we had these poles that were each distance less than 3 tvachim from each other. They were narrow poles. If it doesn't have ptzimin, dibrei kol psula. Everyone agrees there's no walls. Pitikra doesn't factor in here at all, according to this version. Yesh la ptzimin, if it does have these walls, which we saw before, everyone agrees it's okay. That's going to be the subject of debate according to this between Abai and Rava. Abai amar kshera, Rava amar psula. Abai amar kshera amrin on levud. We have laws of levud. If they're less than 3 tvachim apart, we view this as if it's a solid wall. Rava amar psula, lo amrin on levud. He would say you don't say levud. In this case, you can't have an entire wall created with levud of less than 3 tvachim space in between each pole. That just wouldn't work. But but the halacha is that that's not the debate between them. Everyone actually agrees that ptzimin will work. And the debate is, do we say pitikra yoreh v'soteim when there aren't ptzimin? Rav Ashi eshkachil Rav Kahana kamasakech al gabei achsadra she'en la ptzimin. Now this sounds like, okay, so let's translate first. Rav Ashi saw Rav Kahana that he put schach on top of an achsadra that didn't have any ptzimin. Now, it's unfair to say it didn't really have any ptzimin because we're going to see that it did have 2 walls of a sukkah. It was missing its 3rd wall. So now what we have is, this is different from the case that we've seen before, and Rashi explains this. You can even see it here on the picture, on picture 122. They quote Rashi here. Sukkah zo shtayin kilchatan hayula. It had 2 halachic walls inside this courtyard that's inside the portico, inside the empty space between the portico roofs. You have 2 walls. The 3rd wall borders on where the portico ends. And then we want to know, right, do we have some imaginary wall here coming down? So he saw Rav Kahana that he put schach on, even though it only had 2 walls and it had no ptzimin, didn't have any beams at all on this wall that was flush against the portico. So Amar Le, so Rav Ashi says to him, Lo savamar had amar Rava yesh la ptzimin kshera and la ptzimin tzula. Don't you hold like Rava who says it doesn't have ptzimin, it's no good? We don't say pitika yoreh v'soteim. So what did Rav Kahana do? Achvele, he pointed to him and he said, you didn't pay attention. There's something additional here. Now let's move to page 120, to picture 123. He showed him that there was a beam on the 3rd side. Remember, the 3rd side only needs to be 1 tefach wide. So he said, he showed him, if you're outside, you wouldn't see this wall because really it looks like it's just a continuation. It's all a matter of your angle. And this we saw in Mavoy, and we're going to see it again inside. This is called Nir Ebi Bifnim. You have a beam there, but when you're looking, and it's a very small beam, right? And it's thin. And when you're looking from the outside, it just looks like it's a continuation of wall number 2. It doesn't look like a 3rd wall, but when you're inside, you actually see the wall. The picture is very helpful here in 123 because again, it goes in a tefach into the sukkah. So when you're in the sukkah, you see a wall. So if it's noticeable from the inside, even though from the outside, it looks flush like it's the 2nd wall, it's good. Or inami, alternatively, you could have nir'emi bachutz v'shaveh bifnim. This is an interesting halacha because that at least is your 3rd wall being a tefach. Here, instead of that tefach, that handbreadth of beam that you have there is actually borders on that 2nd wall, but juts out of the sukkah instead of into the sukkah. So when you're outside, you actually see it, depending obviously on your angle, but when you're let's say inside the portico and you're looking at this wall, you see this part jutting out because it juts out into the portico. But when you want to go inside the sukkah, you actually don't see it at all. Again, this is picture 124. From the inside, you don't see it, but it's viewed from the outside. And then, so it's either one of those was the case. De'itmar, and it was said, now we're going to see it in the cases of Eruvin, which is, again, your mavoi needs a lechi. It needs some sort of standing beam or cross beam, right? Or standing post or a cross beam that goes across. Now we're going to talk about the lechi. If you have the lechi, which is standing up, the last class we spoke about the kolat, the cross beam. If you have this lechi that's standing up, normally you would assume it stands up and it juts out from the wall. But what if it's on the wall on the outside of the mavoi and it's flush against the wall, so it's not jutting out into, when you're in the courtyard, the mavoi, the alley, and you're looking out, you actually don't see it. That would be nir'emi b'chutz v'shavemi b'fnim. Okay, this is picture 125, where the lechi is kind of pasted on the wall on the outside of the wall. So outside the mavoi, you see it, but you don't see it from the inside. Nidom mishum lechi. Okay, that works. Because as long as you can see it from one direction, there it also gave both options, but here they're only quoting one of them. Whereas as long as you can see it from the outside, it's still good. And therefore, lechi hainu ptzimin, they basically say lechi is like ptzimin, Rav Kana says, and therefore this will work as well in this two-walled sukkah, which has one beam, a small beam for the third wall, whether it's jutting out of the sukkah or whether it's jutting into the sukkah and it's viewed from the outside or from the inside, as long as it's viewed from one direction, it works. Tana. Now we're going to have a braita, and we're going to have to explain what this braita is. We're going to have several different explanations. Psal hayosem in sukkah nidon kisukkah. We saw this before. We explained it in a way different, actually, than all these cases are going to explain, which is if you have schach jutting out of the sukkah, that's what it sounds like anyway. We're going to see maybe it doesn't really mean that. Nidon kisukkah. It's judged like a sukkah. So the assumption here, we read this last time, is if there was no wall on that side, and therefore the schach juts out, and we view that as if it's still part of the sukkah and you can eat in that part. But now they're assuming that there's a wall, and then you have schach that juts beyond that wall. So now they say, "My psal yosem in sukkah." Amar Ula kanima yotzim la achorei sukkah. Ula says it's beams it's schach that's coming outside the sukkah. So now they say, "V'habi inan shalosh tfanot." But if you just have schach jutting outside the sukkah and there's already a wall and it's beyond that wall, there's no walls of the sukkah. There's only one wall, and don't you need three walls? So they say, bid'ika, no, it must be. And here's picture 126. The walls go further beyond, the two side walls go beyond that third wall. So you basically, the sukkah ends, you continue to have walls. So you have a wall that blocks, that's the end of the sukkah. On the back side of the sukkah, you end up with another little sukkah here, right? Which obviously has to be the minimum size, which is what we're going to say right now. But this is a small space. Don't you need minimum 7 by 7? Bid'ika. It must mean it has 7 by 7. But it needs more shade than sun. So they say, bid'ika. No, it must have that. In other words, this has all the criteria of a kosher sukkah. So you basically end up with a sukkah, and the back side of your sukkah also is a sukkah because it's got 3 walls. It's 7 by 7. It's its own designated space, and it has proper schach. So to which the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, isn't that totally obvious that this should be a sukkah? It's got all the criteria of a sukkah. Why do you even need to tell us this? This is similar to what we said before in the beginning of class. Ma'u detema, you might have thought, but wait, this was all the back end of the sukkah, this wall, right? And all the walls weren't really meant to be part of the sukkah. This is the back end of the sukkah. It wasn't meant for the inside space. This was meant to block off from the outside. That wall is the backside of the sukkah. Should it maybe work? Kamash malan, that this also works. So you could basically have one sukkah. If you put a wall in the middle of it, it could count as 2. Even though maybe the back wall is really blocking off that space and you would think it wasn't really part of the sukkah, it can work. That was the first interpretation. Now we're going to go to interpretation number 2. So again, the words are psal hayosem in sukkah. Psal is kosher schach that comes from psolet. Remember the psolet of the goren and the yekev, from the psolet of the wheat and the grapes. That comes out of a sukkah is like a sukkah. So Rabbi Rav Yosef Amri Travayu hacha bekanima yotzim lifnim in sukkah umash chava azla chada dofen bahadai. So now there's reeds coming out, meaning your sukkah continues, your schach continues, right? Outside the sukkah. And one of the walls continue further. So if you see this yellow box in picture number 127, it's like it creates a whole second space because you have your sukkah with 3 walls and your schach. And then the schach continues and only one wall continues out. So that sounds like it's a designated separate space, although, right, we can count this since your other wall is too short. It's still a continuation of that same sukkah. And even though right in this space, there isn't a second wall, it's still fine because you still have the wall on the other end. It's still all as part of the sukkah. So now they say, Ma'u detema ha lepa hechsher sukkah kamash malan. You might have thought even if this space doesn't have 7 by 7, you might have thought it has to be judged as its own independent space, it's still fine. This is still considered a continuation of your other sukkah. Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, third case, most of it has perfectly kosher schach, that the shade is greater than the sun. But a minority of it has chamata meruba mitzelata. Now, you might have thought, ma'u detema, and as you have this small part on the side, look at picture number 128. You have a small part on the side where it's very wide, the gaps, and more sun is coming than shade. So you might have thought, ma'u detema tipasel bahach porta, that maybe that small amount will disqualify your sukkah. Kamash malan, that it doesn't. So now the problem with this is, how do you read this into the words? The words were psal heyotzei min hasukani don kisukah. This isn't exactly psal, good kosher schach that comes out of the sukkah. This is problematic schach that doesn't really have the right criteria for schach that's outside your sukkah, or that's that's a section of your sukkah. So what do they say? Ma yotzei. What is yotzei? Yotzei mehachsher sukkah. It says it goes out of your kosher sukkah. Okay, which means it's not good schach, basically. Psal yotzei min hasukah means psal that leaves the criteria needed for sukkah, meaning it's got too much sun coming in. That's not going to disqualify your sukkah. Again, as long as most of your sukkah is kasher, it's fine. Matkifla Rabbi Yoshaya. Rabbi Yoshaya Amar. Okay, fourth interpretation. Rabbi Yoshaya says, Lo nitzracha ela lischach pasul pachot mishlosha b'sukkah ktana. Oh, it's talking about, okay, next case, if you have a 7 by 7 sukkah, very small sukkah, picture 129, what it's coming to tell you is if you have less than 3 of non-kosher schach, it counts as a kosher sukkah. So now, Uma yotzei, so what is yotzei according to this? Yotzei mitorat sukkah, right, again, psal yotzei min sukkah, that leaves the criteria necessary for sukkah because you don't have 7 by 7 of kosher schach because you have less than 3. That's no good, but it still works because of livud, right? Because we view it as if the schach covers, the kosher schach covers the whole thing. Matkil fala Rav Hoshaya. Rav Hoshaya questions and says, wait a minute. Lo yehe ela avil. Why should this be any different than air, than having an empty space? Va'avir pachot mishlosha b'sukkah ktana mi pasul. In other words, we already said that avir is worse than schach pasul. So if we already know that avir works less than 3, it'll be fine. Then of course schach pasul will work, in which case there's no reason to tell us this halach. So Amar Rabbi Abba, there is a difference. What's the difference? The two have different halachot, and there's actually 2 opposite interpretations here. Which is which? Ze mitztaref v'yeshenim tachtav, v'ze mitztaref v'ein yeshenim tachtav. There's 2 different laws, one for schach pasul and one for avir, for air, one for disqualified schach, one for air. We don't know which is which, and as I said, the commentaries offer arguments in both directions. Either airspace works and it's a totally kosher sukkah and you can sleep in the whole thing. But when it comes to disqualified schach, you cannot sleep underneath that disqualified schach, even if it's less than 3 tvachim. Or it's the reverse. You can't sleep under the airspace, but you can sleep under the disqualified schach. Okay, so there's a debate about one of them is disqualified underneath that space and you can only use the rest of it, which actually creates this strange situation because you then really don't have 7 tvachim of space to use. And how can we actually say that the sukkah is okay? I'll kind of leave that as a question, but that is definitely a question on this sugya. Okay, so, and as I said, there's this debate, which one is more problematic than the other, right? You would think it would be avir is more problematic and you can't sleep under it because we keep saying that airspace is worse than the schach pasul. But some people say, no, it's actually the reverse. How could you have a situation though? This created a strange situation where you have something, we'll close the pictures right now. You have this 7 tvachim sukkah with, again, either it's schach pasul or it's airspace. We don't know which one. It's less than 3 tvachim, so therefore your sukkah is okay. But that in and of itself is disqualified. You can't sleep under there. If you can't sleep under there, how could you have something that's going to join the kosher schach, even though it itself can't be used at all? That seems very illogical. So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elyashiv, I have no problem with that. Why do I have no problem with that? It's like another case where we have a precedent for this. What is the precedent? Tit hanarok. This is water that's mixed with dirt. Now, when you have water mixed with dirt, usually the dirt sinks to the bottom. And if you pour the water, the dirt will stay at the bottom, right? It often happens when you take a pail and you're using, let's say you're washing your floors with a pail and you put the dirty rag in, and then all of a sudden, right, when you dump all the water, all the dirty water, all the sediment is at the bottom. But if it's dirt that gets mixed in, dissolved into the water, if you dump the water would come out with it. It's liquid dirt, basically, or the dirt becomes liquid, it dissolves in the water. Yochiach. This will prove it. For laws of mikvah, what are the laws? Mitztaref la-40 se'ah. If you have water like that was added to a mikvah in order to get to, right, the last amount that was added to get to the requisite amount of 40 se'ah, which is the amount you need in the mikvah, it's okay. You can use that kind of water. However, hatovel bo lo al talo tefillah. But if you dunk in a pail of water, like, a mikvah of water that's full of that kind of water, it won't work. But yet some of it can be used to, a small amount of it can fix a mikvah, even though by itself it can't, it could fix. Likewise here, the airspace itself wouldn't work, but it could fix a sukkah, either the airspace or the schach pasul, depending on which interpretation you go by. New Mishnah. This is going to have no roof on it, okay? This is a sukkah. We saw this before. It's like a tzarif. So in this picture, we have it as, forget the bottom of this, but we have like one beam at the top that kind of supports all the beams going down angled. Or it could be more like a teepee where it comes to one point at the top. Either has this roof, but the roof is very narrow. It's not even a tefach wide, so it doesn't count as a roof. And, it just goes down like an upside down V. Or it could be more like a teepee where it comes to a point at the top. So if you have a hut like that, or shesamcha lekotel, or you just put the schach, now again, this picture isn't the right picture because this is already with the Gemara's interpretation after, but if this angled wall, okay, imagine just an angle, a diagonal, goes flush up against the wall. So again, it doesn't have a roof. Rabbi Eliezer posel lefi she'ein la gag. It doesn't have a roof and therefore it's no good. The chachamim machshirim, the rabbis say, actually this works and it's fine. So now the Gemara is going to say, Tana, modeh Rabbi Eliezer, she'im higbiha me'akarka. Here come the pictures. The Rabbi Eliezer agrees, even though he says in the Mishnah it's no good. He says that if you raised it off the floor by a tefach, oh, shifligam and a kotel tefach, that's 130. You raised it off the floor, which already makes it more tent-like because it then, supposed to just angling down, it then goes down straight. Or you move this angled wall that goes up, the angled sukkah that goes up against the wall, you moved it away a tefach from the wall. Now it has a roof that's a tefach. If you did that, shik shira, they would agree that it's okay. So now let's go back to their reasons. My Tamayu de Rabbanan, why do they think this is okay? Because they say, shipulei oalim koalim dame. Angled tents, right? TP is a tent. It's the same thing. Abaye, eshkechel Rav Yosef, de kagani bekilat chatanim besukkah. A kilat chatanim was made in this kind of way. And he saw Rav Yosef, Abaye saw Rav Yosef sleeping in this kilat chatanim. Now, if it's good sukkah, then it would basically disqualify your other sukkah. This would be a sukkah in a sukkah, which is no good. So Amarle, Kiman, Rabbi Eliezer, what you hold like Rabbi Eliezer, that this doesn't count as a sukkah? Shavat Rabbanan va'avat Rabbi Eliezer, what you left the mainstream opinion and you went with an individual opinion? So Amarle, Rabbi Yosef said to him, no, Braita ifchatane, there's a Braita where it says the exact opposite. Rabbi Eliezer, machshir v'chachamim poslim. The Braita says the opposite of our Mishnah. So then he questions him further. So you have a Mishnah that says the Rabbi Eliezer says it's no good, but the Braita says Rabbi Eliezer says it's good. Shavak manitim b'avet k'braita. We always go with the Mishnah over a Braita. Why are you picking the Braita? So the Mishnah is actually reflecting one person's opinion. It's what's interesting, right? It's one person's opinion saying that the majority opinion is that it's good, and the minority is it's not good. But here we're going to see that's only someone's opinion that's really the machloket. Titanya, who says Sukkato kamin tzarich. Osha samcha lakotel. Rabbi Natan says Omer. Rabbi Eliezer posel mipnei she'en lagag b'chachamim machshirim. Rabbi Natan was the one who thought that Rabbi Eliezer disqualifies it, and the rabbi said it's good. But that implies that everybody else thought that it was the reverse, that the rabbi said it was no good, and Rabbi Eliezer said it was good. In which case, when he slept in this kilat chatanim, it's because he didn't think that was a good sukkah, like the rabbis, according to the rabbis, and not according to Rabbi Natan's reading. So that's why in the end he doesn't go with our Mishnah, because our Mishnah is really just an individual's opinion. New Mishnah. Machzelet kanim gedola. Okay, if you have a big mat of reeds, asa'a l'shkiva mekabelet tuma. If you made it for lying on, then it would be susceptible to impurity, because that's something that's something useful. And then obviously you can't use it for schach. But if it was made for the purposes of schach, then it's perfectly good for schach, because you made it for schach. It wasn't usable for other things, since you designated it for schach. Again, your designation is significant here, and therefore it's not makabel tuma, it's not susceptible to impurity. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, it doesn't matter the size. That was all a large one we were saying. He says it doesn't matter the size. It all depends. He says it doesn't matter the size. The Tanakama seem to say it's only if it was a large one. If it was a small one, it was clearly made for sitting on. Rabbi Eliezer says any size, it all depends on what you intended. The Gemara now says this whole Mishnah doesn't really make sense. Hagufa kashya. The Mishnah itself is difficult. Tama, the reason why is because asa l'shkiva. Hastama, right? The Mishnah talks about if you do it l'shkiva or you do it for schach. What about if I didn't designate it as anything? Where would it go? So from the beginning of the Mishnah, you would imply, from the first part of the statement, you would imply one. From the second part of the statement, you would imply the other. Okay, here this is very common. When it says, if you do it for this, or it's this. If you do it for that, you do it for that. What about if it was stam? So each one would infer something different. From the beginning, it sounds like only if you did it for shchiva is it a problem. But hastama l'sikuch. But if you didn't designate it in either which way, it would be obvious that you did it for schach, and it would be okay. But if you look at the next part, if you did it specifically for schach, then you could use it as a cover, but it's right, and it's not makabel tuma. Tama da asa l'sichuch, only because you designated it for schach. Hastama, but if you didn't designate it for anything, you would imply from the second line that it must be hastama l'shchiva, and then you can't use it for schach. So the Gemara answers halokasha, kam bigdola, kam bigtana. Okay, this isn't really a problem. It all depends whether it's large or whether it's small. So in the beginning, he was talking about a large one. Large one, stam l'sikuch. That makes sense. Only if you said l'shkiva is it going to be makabel tuma. But when he says if it's l'sikuch, he was already switching to a small one. Okay, and the small one, we're going to assume it's for sitting on unless you did it for sikuch, and that resolves that problem. We're now going to skip the next two lines because they're in parentheses. Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Now we're going to go to Rabbi Eliezer. Again, we're going to have the same problem with him. And there you can't say one is gedola, one's ktana, because he starts off with chag gedola ve'chag ktana. So tama da asa l'shkiva, right? First he says, if it's l'shkiva, it's mekabelet tuma, it's acceptable and you can't use it. Hastama, it sounds like if you didn't specify, it would be l'sikuch. And in Maseifa, the second part though says asa l'sikuch mesachachim ba ve'ena mekabelet tuma, which sounds like tama da asa l'sikuch hastama l'shchiva. So again, we're going to have that exact same contradiction in the words of Rabbi Eliezer, and we don't understand. So I'm going to stop here for today because Rav is going to start, and it's going to go into tomorrow's daf to explain how he explains Rabbi Eliezer and this seeming contradiction between the inference from the first part of his words to the inference from the second part of his words, which each infer the opposite. So we'll figure this out tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.